if I could invite everyone to take their seats, and we'll get started with our program this afternoon. Ooh, it's like a movie theater. It just got very dark. All right, good afternoon. My name is Laura Henry, and I'm an associate professor of government and legal studies here at Bowdoin. And I have the great pleasure of welcoming you to the opening celebration for our newest and greenest academic building, the Roux Center for the Environment. Over the next few days, you'll be hearing about this LEED Platinum building and the opportunities for collaboration and innovation that it will provide. But since this is the first event of our celebration, I'd like to take a moment to thank some people. First and foremost, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to Dave and Barb Roux, who are here with us today. Dave and Barb, thank you for the gift that made this building possible, for your vision, for the ambitious and creative work that the center will support. To President Rose, thank you for your leadership in translating this vision into concrete new opportunities for research and teaching. To Dean McCormick, thank you for bringing our speakers together today for a lively discussion. And thank you to the faculty members who helped organize this event and who will be on stage later this afternoon. I also would like to thank my stalwart colleagues with offices and classrooms in the Roux Center who have taught, researched, and advised in the building even as the last stages of construction were underway. From your days wearing hard hats, I know that you appreciate the building, from its very girders, drywall, nuts and bolts, all the way to the gorgeous result. For those of you not fortunate to live in Maine, I would like to welcome you to this beautiful place. Our study of the environment, wherever our research might take us, is inspired daily by our surroundings. And we are part of a long lineage of those who have used and managed and been inspired by Maine's natural environment, who have studied and written about the environment and advocated for its protection while based in Maine. The Wabanaki, the people of the Dawn land, who live with the land for thousands of years and who are an important part of Maine today. Immigrants and their descendants who fished, felled timber, farmed, and lived off the land in a different way. Kate Furbish, who chronicled the native plants of Maine. Henry David Thoreau, who trembled before the stern and savage Maine wilderness. Rachel Carson, who contemplated the sea from Booth Bay Harbor as she developed her landmark book, The Silent Spring. And Maine Senator Edmund Muskie, who advocated for the Clean Water Act. An illustrious history indeed. Maine is clearly a good place for thinking big about the environment. Environmental issues from the local to the global meet and entangle and shape our daily lives. Today in Maine, we contentiously debate issues such as new national parks, the co-management of lobster, bear hunting, and east-west highway, the placement of wind turbines, and models of economic development that can address persistent poverty, and the integration of new Mainers, some refugees displaced by drought or war. And urgent environmental questions loom larger every day. The most recent report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us that time is short to mitigate the effects of sea level rise, desertification, ecosystem collapse, and further human displacement. Avoiding the most serious damage from climate change requires transforming the world's economy within just a few years. This is a task that can seem insurmountable. It seems, as Carl Sagan has said, we are by accident of fate alive at an absolutely critical moment in the history of our planet. This accident of fate means that we have the responsibility to meet the challenges of our era, but we will each do so in our own way. Some of us will choose science. Addressing environmental questions requires rigorous scientific research. But we have learned from debates over climate change that even innovative and meticulous science is insufficient to tackle challenges that require collective action and a common purpose. Environmental challenges indeed engage all aspects of human understanding. We need literature and the visual arts to stimulate our curiosity, our concern, and our compassion, and to convey the beauty and the fragility of the natural world. We need to learn from history, from the migration of peoples long ago, and in order to deepen our understanding of how we arrived at this moment, we need ethics and the humility to examine our ideas of what constitutes justice as we make hard choices. We need to engage diverse communities, reaching beyond those who share our experiences and our opinions. We need the linguistic skills and cultural sensitivity to collaborate with and learn from others. And we need policy options, legal opinions, persuasive arguments, mathematical models, and economic analysis to better understand the merits of alternative paths. From this even incomplete list, you can appreciate the insight of my colleague, Matthew Klingel, who is the Director of Environmental Studies and Associate Professor of History, who has said, "The study of the environment is where the liberal arts converge." Bowdoin College is proud to have been at the forefront of environmental studies as an expression of the liberal arts in Maine and nationally. A visionary group of faculty founded Bowdoin's Environmental Studies program in 1972. This program has been the locus of genuine interdisciplinarity. Evidence of this can be seen in how the Directorship of Environmental Studies has seamlessly flowed across faculty, jointly appointed in departments such as economics and philosophy, biology, earth and oceanographic science, and history. And we've seen the mutual respect and the interdependence of our faculty engaged in our team-taught introductory environmental studies course, as well as research collaborations large and small across the disciplines. As we inaugurate the Roux Center and look toward the future, we are fortunate to build on this strong foundation. So we have a passionate and committed community of scholars and students working on the environment at Bowdoin. But through the Roux Center, we have the opportunity to broaden our existing research and community engagement, to do even more to transcend the disciplinary boundaries of the past. We undertake this task in a building that is inspiring for its achievements in efficiency and design, a facilitating and a catalyzing space, not only for traditional learning, but also for the insight that comes from a chance meeting, a casual conversation, the discovery of a shared curiosity. The Roux Center provides a location and an impetus to invite in those who have not previously considered the environment as an explicit component of their studies, to start new conversations, and to have them teach us about how their work grapples with our shared quest to live harmoniously with each other and the natural world. It is a place where we can invite those studying the environment from other parts of the globe to learn about approaches to the environment devised by other communities and using other systems of knowledge. It is only with a diversity of voices and experiences and opinion, with give and take, with an expansive view of what the environment is and what it means in different contexts, that we can begin to find a common path forward. So, my vision for the Roux Center, and one that I hope you'll share, begins with a gorgeous building with a green roof and a lantern space for gathering and new technology for research and teaching. But to live and breathe, to shape our community, to make a difference, the Roux Center will be what we make of it, what happens inside, who feels welcome to gather there, who uses the space, and the discussion and study that it enfolds and elevates. The Roux Center can be a hub of intellectual engagement, a place where ideas and energy from all disciplines and student groups flow in to be debated, critiqued, and refined. And then those ideas and energy can flow out again to inspire and stimulate action on campus and far beyond. Thank you. Thank you. If you take a moment to look at your program, you'll see that we have invited 3 distinguished speakers representing different academic disciplines engaged in the study of the environment. These presentations will be followed by a faculty-led question and answer session. After a brief intermission, we have a panel of 3 accomplished Bowdoin alumni who will also be making brief presentations and then participating in a Q&A with the audience. I turn now to my colleague, Colin Ressler of Earth and Oceanographic Science, who will be introducing Steve Favres.
Thank you, Laura. It is my pleasure to introduce Steve Favres. Dr. Steve Favres is a senior scientist, and this is a mouthful, at the Center for Climatic Research, which is part of the Nelson Institute at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He started his career with an interest in meteorology, and as you can see, he got his degree at Purdue University, but continued his research and his interest in meteorology and climatology by getting a PhD at the University of Wisconsin and Madison. His research focused on the use of computer-based climate models. And I'll let that sit with you, because sometimes when you say models, people, their eyes glaze over. But this is a very particular type of model, and I think it's worth spending a moment to tell you about it. It's called the Community Earth System Model. And as the name implies, it's about community. It's about a community of scientists coming together to build and use this model. It's freely available. Anyone can use it if you know how. People can contribute to it, contribute their ideas to it. And that's what makes the modeling community so vibrant, and he's a part of that. The other part of it is Earth system. It's an Earth system model. So you're not just studying the atmosphere or the ocean, even though I would love to just study the ocean. You can't study the ocean without understanding the atmosphere, the land surface, the sea ice. And so this model brings together the systems of the Earth so that you can understand how they interact and the feedbacks between them. And that's the way we can have a better understanding of the climate. So the Arctic is a particular interest to Steve, and I assume he's going to talk a little bit about the Arctic today, I hope. Not only because we know the Arctic has experienced climate change to the greatest extent on the planet, but also because it appears that the changes in the Arctic are having impacts on the weather of North America. And so we can start to think about large-scale changes of climate, but having impacts on weather. And he's been working with his colleague, Jennifer Francis, and they've published a number of papers in the last few years talking about this connection. So when I say polar vortex, what does that mean to you? Yeah, cold weather, right? So there's a connectivity between what happens in the Arctic, not staying in the Arctic, but impacting us. Finally, working beyond the pure science, Dr. Favres is actually actively bringing his expertise to the intersection of science and societal impacts. And this is why we are so pleased to have him here. And he's going to speak today to us about his thoughts on how we can understand our environmental future from this perspective. Thank you so much, Dr. Favres.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here at Bowdoin College on this historic day. When I received the invitation back in June, I readily accepted. I certainly knew of the college from your reputation. What I didn't realize at the time, though, was what a strong Arctic connection this place had. And then I discovered you have this great Arctic Museum, an Arctic Studies program, and then, best of all, a polar bear for your mascot. And so I knew that this was just meant to be, and I would feel comfortable here. So thank you very much. So the title of the talk, The Future is Here, is indicative of the massive changes that are taking place in the Arctic environment these days. And one way to get an assessment of that is to talk to the folks who have been there the longest. This is a compilation of interviews that was put together by the Smithsonian about 15 years ago called The Earth is Faster Now. And it gets its name from comments from one of the native elders who said the weather patterns are changing so quickly, it seems the Earth is moving faster now. So they could no longer, even 15 years ago, use the same kind of environmental cues to anticipate how the weather would change for hunting purposes or whatnot. And certainly that sentiment is even more true today. And one way we know that through more traditional science means is through the satellite records, beginning about 40 years ago, showing the warming trend in different parts of the world. You'll notice a lot of warm colors here, yellow and oranges, but very distinctly you can see that the maximum warming trend is taking place in high latitudes. And this is not a surprise. This was very much anticipated. The geologic record indicates that this is true too. When the Earth warms a little, the Arctic warms a lot. And we can get a clue as to why this is by noticing that the warming is taking place mainly over the Arctic Ocean, more so than Arctic land. And the reason why that is happening is because sea ice. And the ice cover is very bright. It reflects a lot of sunlight that would otherwise reach the surface, so that's a cooling mechanism. And during the winter, it acts as an insulating barrier to protect the cold atmosphere from getting the heat from the relatively warm ocean. So if you remove that ice cover, you end up getting a significantly warmer climate. And we can see that again through these satellite images. So the first year of the record in 1979 is showing here the amount of ice cover remaining in mid-September after a summer's worth of melt. The pinks and dark pinks indicate where the ice was particularly compact, and you can see that it was covering virtually the entire Arctic Ocean. And now if we fast forward a few decades to the record minimum just a few years ago, this is how it looked on exactly the same date in September in 2012. Less than half the ice cover remaining. What's left is less compact than it used to be. And I didn't completely cherry pick 2012 because it was the record. Turns out that every summer since 2007 has looked a lot more like this than like that. And so it's a remarkable kind of step change, a new normal, if you will, for Arctic sea ice. And to put it in perspective of how much this is, the difference here in ice cover is equal to the land areas of the 6 largest European countries, minus Russia, combined. So this is a very sizable change in the Arctic environment. One of the reasons this matters is that a lot of systems depend on sea ice. One of them is ecological communities. Walruses and polar bears have become sort of the poster children for environmental change in the Arctic. They may not be the most biologically important in terms of the impact that ice loss has. Algae, for example, depend on sea ice for habitat. But nonetheless, in a visual sense, the walruses and polar bears really stand out. And one example is this image that made it kind of viral a few years ago. This is called a walrus haul-out on an Alaskan beach. This was taken right at this time of year in October. You can make out this, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of walruses stranded here on a beach, and they're in a holding pattern waiting for the ice cover to form, and the ice is forming late, and so they had to wait it out because they depend on the ice cover for their habitat. They're also skittish, and if one of them starts to get excited and starts to trample, it can lead to a stampede and actually lead to deaths of walruses too, so it has a dangerous element to it as well. Not only for walruses and polar bears, but for humans, this is a big deal, the loss of ice cover. So a couple years ago, this brave company came up with a plan called the Crystal Serenity. This is a luxury cruise through the Arctic Ocean. And they had the temerity to plan to go through the Northwest Passage, which was legendarily inaccessible. And so this is where we are today, that this company had felt like it was a safe enough decision to book all of these people on this ship and take them through the Northwest Passage, and they passed without incident. They picked a great summer. It was nearly the minimum ice cover, but no one in their right mind 20 years ago would have come up with this as a business model. With that more accessible Arctic Ocean comes other problems, some geopolitical conflict problems on the horizon, if they're not already here. So a lot of different Arctic countries are making various claims to the Arctic Ocean now that it's accessible and becoming more available in terms of resource extraction, for example. And with that comes conflict in terms of who owns what. The Russian defense minister just last month admonished the Arctic has turned into an object of territorial resource and military strategic interest, and warning this could lead to growth and the potential for conflict in this region. And it certainly feels that way right now. It's not only ice cover that's dwindling, but another cryospheric component is snow cover. A lot of ecosystems depend on snow cover for camouflage or for warmth. Snow cover has the same sort of energetic effect as sea ice too. It's bright, it's insulating, and so its loss helps to accelerate the warming trend. And we see that again from the data showing the snow cover anomaly. This was the record minimum of spring snow cover in 2016. These warmer colors indicate where there was less snow cover than usual, and that's covering most of the northern hemisphere, especially western North America. And so with less snow cover means the winters tend to be milder, the spring is warmer, the ground has an earlier chance to warm up to get a head start on the summer warm season. And so not surprisingly, we're seeing some really exceptional warmth during the winters now even. This is a very warm, winter warm record in 2018, just this year. Made it into my local Wisconsin newspaper, reference to a heat wave in the Arctic. You don't think of heat waves in Arctic winter very often, but now that term's being thrown around. And then just a few months later, it was a very warm summer, not only in the Arctic, but in much of the northern hemisphere, making the news in the New York Times, wildfires raging in the Arctic Circle. And here's something kind of shocking, a 90-degree heat north of the Arctic Circle in northern Finland. I don't know how often that's happened, but it must be very rare. And these wildfires have grown, the large wildfires in the Arctic have increased by nearly tenfold this century. And part of that is the warmer, drier conditions as we get less snow cover. And it was so warm that even reindeer were seen trying to cool off. This is in a Finnish river somewhere. And this really, picture's worth 1,000 words here, right? When it's hot enough for reindeer needing to cool off. So one of the important factors about this, or implications for the lack of snow cover and the excessive warmth, is that it leads to thawing permafrost. So much of the Arctic is locked in frozen soils, especially in Siberia, and these frozen soils contain an enormous amount of carbon that's been frozen for many, many thousands of years. And as long as it's frozen in the soil, we're well off in terms of the atmosphere, but the concern is this permafrost thaws, a lot of that carbon will be released to the atmosphere in terms of methane and carbon dioxide and could accelerate the warming. But in the short term, there are practical implications about building things on permafrost that was once solid and reliable. Once it starts to thaw, you can lose buildings, you can lose roads, and this is called a drunken forest, the soggy soil underneath these trees. Another change that's happening dramatically in the Arctic with practical implications is the erosion of coastlines. Coastal erosion has doubled in the last 50 years, and parts of the Arctic are seeing 20 meters a year of coastal erosion. And a lot of that is because we don't have the buffering effect of sea ice to suppress waves, and there's a lot of thawing permafrost in coastal bluffs. And it's gotten so bad that communities are having to relocate in some cases. This is Shishmaref 2 summers ago, voting to relocate. I mean, what a drastic step to have to move your entire community. But when you have things like this happening often enough, it seems like. So these are changes that are happening within the Arctic today, indisputable, not climate change projections. And so there's a lot of concern, but an even bigger concern, or maybe an extension of this concern, is what is the reach of Arctic climate change? Not just within the Arctic, but beyond. So another way of asking it is, does what happens in the Arctic stay in the Arctic? We hope that it does, but it may not. And if it does not, and to the extent that it doesn't, it should be a concern for everyone on the planet. So here are some examples of ways that we either know or think that the Arctic may be affecting the planet. One that's indisputable is that there's a large amount of melt of glaciers and ice sheets. And when this fresh water gets into the ocean, it raises sea levels, and sea level rise is unmistakable. It's happening especially along the east coast of the United States. It's exacerbating hurricane impacts, like from Hurricane Michael right now. And even aside from flooding from heavy rains or hurricanes, we're getting a lot more of this, what's called nuisance flooding or clear day flooding. So just simply the baseline sea level rising to the point where communities are having to spend, in some cases, millions of dollars to try to keep the seawater out. And every reason to believe that this is going to become a continued problem and probably a worse problem in the future as sea levels continue. Another way that the Arctic warming may be affecting the planet is through the carbon release from permafrost, as I mentioned before. This is not as obvious as you might think, because there's a lot of complications in terms of whether that carbon melting from the thawing permafrost makes it into the atmosphere, but we do see examples of methane bubbles coming out of lakes. You can see some cool videos online of people lighting these and big explosions happening. This is also dramatic, these craters that have formed, presumably from the flammable methane that explodes in Siberia largely. So some dramatic examples. Something that's not as well understood, and something that I'm working on today with Jennifer Francis and others, is trying to understand whether the Arctic warming is affecting atmospheric circulation patterns in the middle latitudes. So this is a depiction of the jet stream winds that steer our weather systems blowing from west to east. And the strength and largely the waviness of these jet stream winds are determined by the temperature difference between the cold Arctic and the warm tropics. The stronger that temperature difference, generally the stronger and straighter the winds. And so the concern is that as we change one of those ends of the spectrum by warming the Arctic, that'll tend to weaken and make wavier this jet stream. And that's important because that really does affect our weather, particularly in the winter. So when we have one of these conditions when the winds are pretty straight circulating around the North Pole, the cold air is basically bottled up within the Arctic, where a lot of us would like it to be. But what happened a few winters ago is this so-called polar vortex happened, and so one of these lobes of cold Arctic air made it down to mid-latitudes. So it's a lot like thinking of a freezer door being shut. It keeps the kitchen warm and the freezer cold. You open that door, and then you get some of that cold air spilling out into the kitchen. In this case, over North America, we had an extremely cold winter. I think you probably got some of the polar vortex as Wisconsin did. And at the same time, as the jet stream buckles here, we see what's called a ridge in the western US, and this is directly responsible for the bad California drought that winter. So you get warm, dry air here, cold air, often stormy in the east, and so extreme weather can result. And so a big open question in the field is, does a warm Arctic lead to a weaker, wavier jet stream? And that's something that is still being determined. So to summarize, I'm gonna get you some of the ins and outs as I see it of Arctic climate change. Some of the ins, things are happening within the polar regions. Global warming is occurring approximately 2 to 3 times as quickly in the Arctic as the rest of the world. We have near record sea ice or snow cover most years nowadays. A lot more wildfires, coastal erosion continuing. And some of the outs, the ways that the Arctic may be affecting the global conditions: melting glaciers and ice sheets, raising sea levels, that's a certainty. Wildfires and thawing permafrost, releasing carbon, that's complicated, but it could be a big wild card. And then the amplified warming affecting large-scale circulation patterns. So that's where things are, but we, of course, want to know where things are headed as we look out into the uncertain Arctic future. What'll things look like 10, 20, 30 years down the road? Well, no one really knows for sure, but some questions to pose in that light. What will be the pace of future Arctic change and its impacts? So we're pretty confident of the direction of future Arctic climate change, but the pace is a lot less certain. The paleoclimate record indicates that Arctic climates have changed abruptly in the past, sometimes within a decade. And if that's the future that we're going to be seeing, that's a very different animal than if it's a very slow, gradual change, albeit a large change eventually. Another issue that's very important: how can and should Arctic communities, both human and ecological, adapt to the changing climate? Is it as dire as communities having to relocate, or are there more resilient measures that can be taken to adapt to this very big change in our environment? And finally, in what ways and by how much does the transforming Arctic affect the planet? So I've given you a few ways as examples, but even the ways that the Arctic may be affecting the planet, this question of how much is really important. Is it still kind of within the noise of other factors, or is it really becoming a primary driver? And that's something that scientists are working on fervently today. I'm take hope in the fact that through places like Bowdoin and an organization I've been involved in, SEARCH, the study of environmental Arctic change, which I'll talk about in a moment, that we can help to address these sorts of questions and have a better future as the Arctic transforms. Bowdoin, I know you have a very strong interdisciplinary history, as we heard earlier, and especially with this new Roux Center, there's a lot of optimism for that, different disciplines getting together to tackle these sorts of problems. I've been involved quite a few years with SEARCH on the steering committee. This is an interagency national program that has its mission to advance the scientific understanding and collaboration of Arctic change to help society respond to this rapidly changing Arctic. It consists of a lot of different funding agencies, including some like Smithsonian and USDA you might not think of. And I'll leave as the takeaway message that the purpose of SEARCH, I think, serves as a good model for where things can go. And the idea is that we move beyond our disciplinary lenses, and scientists, the Arctic science community writ large, works on synthesizing information from various types of scientific information. There is direct communication in a loop with stakeholders. So these include policymakers, local communities, media, lawmakers, and so forth. And we have a conversation, and it's iterative. So rather than the old model of, scientists produce information, go to the loading dock and hand it off and hope somebody picks it up, this is a much more modern and I think a much more effective means of engaging and producing actionable science. So I will leave it at that, and we can take up some of these questions some more during the Q&A session later. Thanks for your attention.
Rebecca Henderson is the John and Natty MacArthur University professor at Harvard University. Before I go on and tell you a little bit about her, please note the title, University Professor. I found out this the other day, it was a rank that was created in 1935 to honor individuals whose groundbreaking work crosses the boundaries of disciplines. So Rebecca is granted the opportunity to do research at any of Harvard schools. So I think it's very appropriate given what we're doing today and thinking about interdisciplinary work and how she has that special title. She's only one of, I think, 35 right now, if I got that right, I'm not sure. So Rebecca has spent much of her career studying why large companies find it difficult to change. One part of the answer is the phenomenon of what she calls overload. Essentially, the failure to spend time planning for the future because one is so concerned about the immediate issues today. This phenomena applies to individuals as well as companies. For example, even though we know that skimping on sleep is bad for us, we do it anyways because we want to watch TV for just one more hour. So the dangers of such short-term thinking are also the theme of her current work as co-director of the Business and Environment Initiative at Harvard Business School. Predictions of the fallout for climate change are dire: diminished crop yields, coastal inundation, prolonged heat waves, etc. Yet legislation to confront climate change fails again and again in Washington and state capitals. Too many politicians argue, why make changes to our economic system that's working pretty well today when we can deal with this problem in the future? Oh, and by the way, maybe this problem doesn't even exist at all. All right, so we have that. So will we ever act in a meaningful way to mitigate climate change, or will we simply accept a less robust and less stable world, right? So that's the question. Are we going to do something about this, or are we just gonna let things happen and just kind of live in this worse world? Rebecca remains an optimist. Even with the government gridlock at many levels, she believes the private sector has strong incentives to deliver products that will generate a better environmental future. We need clean energy, we need abundant clean water, we need safe and effective waste disposal, she says. Business can do that. And just as purpose-driven businesses help deliver the exponential economic growth experienced across the world over the last 200 years, she believes that a purpose-driven private sector can lead us to an even more prosperous future. So of course, the big question is, will they?
Eric, thank you very much for that introduction. I really appreciate your taking the time to move beyond the first 3 words on my website. That was a little disconcerting. It is a great pleasure to be here. When Clayton, with whom I was teaching at the Harvard Business School, told me that he was leaving, I was only persuaded to forgive him by the fact that he was coming to be president at Bowdoin, which is a marvelous institution, despite the fact that you did not admit my son. He ended up at Swarthmore, so all's well that ends well. But I had the chance to see just what a fantastic institution it was, and then the doors were closed in our face. So I'm delighted to be here. I suspect that you, like me, following Stephen's excellent and interesting presentation, are left sort of shuddering with a mixture of despair and rage. What are we going to do? And so Liz asked me to talk to what are we going to do. She also asked me to talk a little bit about my own intellectual background and to be really clear about how interdisciplinary the research was in this space. So I'm going to attempt to do all of that in 18 minutes and 50 seconds. No problem. So my personal obsession, as Eric mentioned to you, is change. I am British, as you may be able to tell from my accent. And when I graduated from MIT, I went to work for McKinsey in London. And working for McKinsey in England in the early 80s meant closing plants in Northern England. And I became deeply interested in the question of why firms find it so difficult to remake themselves. So this is a graph of industry or firm evolution over time. And basically in the beginning, in what's called a period of ferment, no one knows what's going on, there's not much progress. But if things go well, you work out what's going on, you see takeoff, everybody gets very excited, and then the industry gradually moves to maturity. So I was the Eastman Kodak Professor of Management at MIT for many years. So you can think of an Eastman Kodak in this way, right? In the beginning, they invent photography, don't quite know what it is, then it takes off. They're incredibly profitable. People said of Kodak there was nothing more profitable that was legal. But then after a while, they enter maturity. They're just kind of doing the same thing again and again. And oh dear, we get what my colleague Clay Christensen called like, whoa, disruption. And so this problem has been the focus of my research for more than 30 years. I've worked with a whole variety of companies, trying to persuade them to change. There was a particularly interesting year in my life when I was taking saunas in northern Finland, trying to persuade Nokia that the world really was changing, it would be good if they did something. You know with how much success, but also looking at firms that had changed. And about 15 years ago now, my brother persuaded me to read the scientific literature on global warming. And my first reaction was, okay, I better quit. I better stop oiling the wheels of corporate capitalism and get with the program and become an activist. But I was persuaded by my friends and colleagues to stay at MIT, and then ultimately I moved to Harvard about 10 years ago. Because they believed, and I now believe this, as Eric suggested, that business could play an enormous role in making a difference. So the first thing I did was co-edit a book on how we could accelerate energy innovation. So I pulled together experts from a whole range of fields, looking at when there have been major emergencies historically in agriculture, in chemicals, in the internet, where did really rapid change come from? And we came up with 3 answers. So all we needed to do to fix the climate change problem was public support for R&D, low barriers to entry for entrepreneurial firms, and most importantly, a price for carbon. And pricing carbon, that is making it expensive to throw carbon dioxide out of the window, is the economist's dream solution because it's visible, it's elegant, it can be phased in gradually over time, and most importantly, it's likely to work. So 15 years ago, I thought this was the thing. And I went off to see this gentleman. Does anyone know who this is? He won the Nobel Prize on Monday. So his name is Ted Nordhaus, one of the very active proponents of a tax on carbon, but not the only one. And I thought, well, this is easy. We're done. All we need is a tax on carbon. Pause. No tax. Published this great book. No tax. So what's going on? Why don't we have a price on carbon? So the answer is complicated. The easy explanation, of course, is that people are just stupid. I'd spent many years studying change in large corporations, and you always want to keep this explanation at the back of your mind because some people are idiots. But more broadly, people are complicated, right? This is difficult. Putting a price on carbon turns out to be very hard. And as an economist, I found myself spending a lot more time with psychologists trying to understand why this was so difficult. So the thing about climate change is that it's invisible, particularly 15 years ago. So we have what the psychologists call a saliency problem, right? If you pass people sleeping on the pavement every time you walk to class, you sort of get that there's something going on and maybe we should think about inequality. But, you know, climate change is kind of invisible. And even worse, it's going to happen later. So you've got a bunch of people jumping up and down saying, we really must move. 50 years from now, it'll feel really good if we make a difference now, in a world in which people know they should go to the gym because later they'll feel better, but they don't go to the gym. So we're not good at stuff that's delayed. And even worse than that, climate change is going to hit someone else. I mean, at least if I go to the gym, it's my own health I'm working on. But climate change is going to hit first the poor and the dispossessed, largely in the third world, except for those of us who live in Boston and Miami, where it's coming pretty soon. But this is sort of a recipe for problems that humans are bad at. So there are a number of interesting books with titles like Climate Change, the World's Worst Problem. So that's one problem. So that's from the psychologists. When you turn to the politics, we've got a party that has persuaded a good chunk of the American people that climate change is a plot designed to increase the size of government and control your life. We could talk about why this is. In some ways, climate change is a victim of an ongoing political dynamic in this country to discredit government, largely to release controls on the wealthier classes and using racism as a way to do that. So government is bad because what they bring you are people with different colored skins. But this whole idea that government is bad, climate change has got caught up in that. So this is really a bad place to be. And it's given us massive denialism, or at least what my colleague, the historian Naomi Orestes, calls doubt. And so we've seen this coordinated, well-funded plan to try and sow doubt as to whether climate change is happening. So we've got a problem that on the one hand is just psychologically difficult, even if everyone's aligned, and on the other, a huge chunk of the population that like, maybe it's not so happening. Now the good news on that front, well, the bad news. Bad news is, as Stephen suggested, climate change is, alas, really happening. I've dealt with some climate denialists, and I always end up saying, I really, really hope you're right, but I don't think so. You know, climate change is really happening. So let me give you some good news. Yeah? So here's the good news. The good news is this is not per se a technical problem or a resource problem. We have the technology and we have the resources. Now, even if we were to act tomorrow, we're going to see, and Stephen will be the first one to see this, we've got a lot of effects baked in, but it is not impossible to deal with. Estimates suggest maybe 2 to 3% of the world GDP, which is, as you know, significantly less than what the world spends on armaments. And the costs of doing nothing are, depends who you talk to, but up there in the 15, 20%, again, very controversial, but big. The costs of renewable energy are falling much faster than anyone expected, including me. I have for 15 years been saying, look, as soon as we move costs are going to fall way, way faster than you expect, but they actually fell even faster than that. Humans are amazing. If we decided to mobilize, we could deal with this problem. Whenever I get really depressed, I start reading economic histories of World War II. You know, when humans really want to do things, they can do it. And lastly, there's an economic case for investing. So this is the economist in me. It's like it's really not good for business if we destabilize the climate. It's really not good for business if agriculture gets totally unreliable and we see mass migration of millions of people from the south to the north. So there's definitely an economic case. And we're seeing more and more Americans, and I don't mean to be overly US-centric, but the US failure to act is a huge global barrier to action. We're seeing more and more US individuals beginning to think like, whoa, this is really going on. Cheerfully, only about 9% of the population remains entirely dismissive. We've got a clear majority of the population like, whoa, something is going on, we should do something. So that's all pretty good. The bad news is, as you will have noticed, nothing is happening. In fact, that's an incorrect statement. We're running backwards. The current administration is actively dismantling the regimes and policies put in place to deal with global warming. And the US refusal to act is, of course, empowering all kinds of people in the rest of the world who say, well, you know, like, why should I act? I mean, the Americans put all that carbon up there, like, why the heck should we do anything? So very, very tricky. So I study the question of whether business can help. Now, I understand that in some ways this is wildly quixotic. When I was trying to sell the book I'm currently engaged in writing to a senior editor in New York, he looked at me and he said, business saves the world, Rebecca. You don't get out much, do you? Have you read the papers? You know? So this is an unlikely idea. What I would say is what I said to him, which is, do you have any better ideas? Right now, we need everything we can get. Business is a very powerful institution and surprisingly long-lived. That is, the CEOs of the major global corporations, particularly if they're in food or in energy or in anything with a global supply chain, they can see that this is happening. Like they know something is happening, it's not going to be good. So bear with me, 6 minutes how business can save the world, okay? Well, so the first thing is we have to get beyond a single-minded focus on shareholder value maximization. You've probably seen this cartoon, it's still my favorite cartoon. Yes, the planet got destroyed, but for a beautiful moment in time, we created a lot of value for shareholders. So we've got to reclaim the deep roots of business, which are about prosperity and freedom for the entire society. So I'm writing this book, Midnight in the Boardroom, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire. We've just decided on this title, so the reason this is up here is if you don't like it, I want to know. Here's the key idea. We can make money and save the world at the same time. So this is the kind of sophisticated diagram that economists and business school people use to illustrate that concept. Who knows what this is? It's a Tesla. So Tesla is exhibit 1, not because buying a Tesla is a good way to save the world, it's actually probably not, but because Elon Musk's investment in batteries and his insistence we're moving to electric vehicles has almost certainly accelerated the transformation of the world automobile industry and possibly the transformation of the world's energy industry by, you pick it, 5, 6, 7 years, but very significantly. So that when business goes first, when you drive down the learning curve, when you say this is the future, you can really support change. Second reason this may happen, change is never easy. People say, it's not happening, we won't make any money, we can't get it done. That's what I did for 20 years. I've heard more about how hard change is than anyone is. But that makes me kind of cheerful, because this moment we're right in, it's a change moment. Everyone can see we need to go, and everyone's going like, oh no, please, really, really? But if you don't go, you're going to be left behind. And more businesses can see that if you move early and you move fast, if you position yourself, you have a business case in this position. And purpose, which I've become incredibly interested in, purpose-focused businesses can make a real difference. So many of the firms that are out in front are firms that are doing what they're doing because it's the right thing to do. Now, they also have a business case. You can't be a purpose-driven business person if you don't have a business. So, got to make the money, but having a clear sense that your mission in life is not just to build a thriving, prosperous business, your mission in life is also to support the society in which you're engaged, can be an enormous help to moving first. Anyone know who this gentleman is? It's Doug McMillon, the CEO of Walmart, the largest company in the world. They employ more than 1 million people. So I'm going to assert to you that Walmart is one of the more purpose-driven and progressive firms in this space, and you are not going to believe me. I came back from a 3-day trip to Walmart, all bubbly with everything that Walmart was doing, and my son looked at me and he said, "Mum, I believe you because you're my mum, but no one else will." So I tell you what's interesting about Walmart. What's interesting about Walmart is in many ways they represent absolutely the best and the worst of 20th century capitalism. Built from scratch, built from nowhere, unbelievable innovation, changed the way we think about retailing, built the largest company in the world, whoops. Drove labor costs to the bottom, labor conditions to the bottom, supply chains to the bottom. They were amongst the first companies to go like, whoa, this is a bad idea. So interestingly, Walmart now owns more installed solar capacity than any other company in the world. They have a sequence. If you don't believe me, go check out their website. It is amazing what they're doing. And Doug is like, no, this is not good. We have to change. We have to find a new way of working. So they're out there, and I give you Doug, because he's the most unlikely purpose-driven leader I know. This slide is standing in for a massive amount of research on why we believe that purpose may make firms more productive and more innovative. Let me give you one statistic. In the average industry, the most productive firms are more than twice as productive as the least. We cannot make this result go away. It's clearly driven by something around culture, the ability to communicate, by engagement. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that it's driven by purpose and integrity. So purpose can make a big difference. There's tons of amazing purpose-driven leaders out there. Some of them look, white and male and in suits, but they look like all kinds of people. Lots of businesses are going in this direction. And what's exciting is as they work, they discover that they cannot do this on their own. So we're seeing more and more firms cooperate. Those of you who are technical, I'm looking at you, Eric. If you can persuade everyone else to switch to renewable energy, the fact that you're switching means you're not at a competitive disadvantage. So if you can get everyone in your industry together and say, let's go renewable, then you can really make a difference. So we're seeing a lot of people working together to try and make a difference. The one in the bottom is the Roundtable for Sustainable Palm Oil. Deforestation is a huge issue. It's a very large fraction of emissions. This is all the world's biggest consumer goods companies getting together and saying, we have to end deforestation. I'll take the cost if you'll take the cost, because in the long term, we need a supply chain. Now, you do that for long enough, you discover that cooperation is great but difficult, so you begin to think about large-scale systemic change. So one of the exciting things we're beginning to see is firms rediscovering the power of regulation, the power of transparent government, the power of honest media, the power of strong democracy, because it's what you need to really make progress against these issues. So we're seeing enormous conversation in the capital markets. At the moment, I'm writing a case about the Japanese government pension fund, the GPIF. You've probably never heard of it. It's one of the largest pools of wealth in the world. They control $1.6 trillion. They own 6% of the Japanese stock market, 1% of the world's equity markets, and they are crazy about climate. They would put it more politely, like they're investment bankers and so on. But I'm going to say, they're like, we have to stop this. This is a danger to the world. My fiduciary responsibility is to pensioners 20 and 30 years from now. Climate change puts the long-term prosperity of the economy at risk. My fiduciary duty requires me to push firms to reduce carbon emissions. And we're seeing these kinds of actions begin to support social change, and just the beginning of this conversation, which is we cannot let the institutional structures of society fall apart. we have a collective interest in making a difference. So it's really exciting, lots of things going on, like the Global Climate Action 100, which is targeting the largest 100 carbon emission firms. Let's join together, let's put pressure on them to reduce. So, in conclusion, we can do this. It can be done. It is nuts to destabilize the climate, cause massive ecological destruction, death and suffering for thousands of years, for 3% of GDP? Like, come on. I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying it's obvious. I'm not saying it's guaranteed. I'm saying it's possible. So let me close with Maimonides. Hope is belief in the plausibility of the possible as opposed to the necessity of the probable. We have the resources, we have the technology. If we keep a hold of hope, we can fix this problem. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Michael Kolster. I'm a photographer, teacher, and currently chair of visual arts at Bowdoin, otherwise known as the Department of Complicated People. It is my pleasure to introduce the next speaker, Stephanie Rothenberg, the 2018-19 inaugural Roux Scholar. Professor Rothenberg has already visited campus this fall to meet with classes and faculty. She will be in residence for an extended visit in the spring, at which time she will be creating artwork in collaboration with our students. She'll be working from a studio space located in Roux. Please note that after Professor Rothenberg's talk, our three speakers will gather back on stage to address some questions from the faculty who introduced them, and if time permits, to take some questions from the audience. It will take a moment to arrange the stage with tables for the Q&A after Professor Rothenberg's talk, but please stay in your seats. The intermission will follow the Q&A. Thank you. As an artist myself, I am very pleased to introduce Professor Rothenberg. Part of the pleasure is to describe for you some of her many accomplishments before she gives her address today. Another part of my excitement on this auspicious occasion is to recognize the longstanding commitment the college has made to the Environmental Studies program since its inception in 1972, 46 years ago. Initially formed from discussions across the faculty, including the involvement of my predecessor, photographer John McKee, and my former visual arts colleague, painter Tom Cornell, the program has been a guiding light of interdisciplinary and cross-disciplinary study of the environment. The Environmental Studies program offers a coordinate major, essentially a double major, that must be conducted with another department on campus. ES, as it is known on campus, ES being Environmental Studies, not Science, states the following in its mission statement. 3 convictions guide the design of Bowdoin's coordinate Environmental Studies major. First, students' academic foundation should be disciplinary and interdisciplinary, fostering an integrated understanding. Second, it should encompass perspectives from the curriculum's 3 broad divisions: arts and humanities, natural science, and social science. Third, it should offer abundant opportunities for students to supplement their academic learning with experiences outside the classroom, helping them to discover their vocations, acquire practical skills, form lifelong habits, and develop networks of relationships. Bowdoin's claim that it is a leader in the study of the environment, often heard these days on Maine Public Radio, and I'm sure many other places, is largely due to the vision and persistence of the people working over the decades on behalf of the Environmental Studies program. Its faculty members, dedicated staff, and indefatigable program directors. They come from their own different disciplines and against all odds have managed to overcome the territorial disputes that all too often undermine study across and between disciplines. The program's team-taught ES 1101, Introduction to Environmental Studies, is currently enrolled at 88 students and 2 auditors, making it one of the college's largest and most popular classes. The program boasts 32 current faculty members contributing or jointly appointed to the program. They represent 12 distinct academic departments that span the curriculum's 3 divisions: history, biology, government, chemistry, physics, English, art history, earth and oceanographic science, economics, anthropology and sociology, German, and mathematics. Now that ES has a new home in Roux, we celebrate its accomplishments and look forward to continued growth and effective inter- and cross-disciplinary approaches to the study of the environment. And hopefully, we will witness a renewed sense of the need for an even more substantive place in ES for the arts and humanities, given the complexity of the problems we face and must negotiate together, both locally and globally, going forward. I think there's quite a bit of hope for that, given the introduction I'm about to give for the person that's here today, Stephanie Rothenberg. Professor Stephanie Rothenberg, the 2018-2019 inaugural Roux Scholar, is an artist and a researcher who uses performance, installation, living organisms, and networked media to create provocative public interactions. Our Roux Scholar's work exemplifies the rich potentials of struggling with the uncertainties located within any serious exploration of the natural world and any substantive analysis of the social relationships defining life on this planet. Her work moves between real and virtual spaces, investigating the power dynamics of techno-utopias, global economics, and outsourced labor. Rothenberg's most recent project, Reversal of Fortune, uses the metaphor of a garden and its struggle to survive in order to explore the complex relationship between economic growth and the human experience. She has exhibited throughout the US and internationally in venues including I-Beam and the New York Hall of Science in New York City, the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, otherwise known as MassMoCA in North Adams, the Sundance Film Festival, the University of Caldes and Manizales, Colombia, the House of Electronic Arts in Basel, Switzerland, Laboral in Gijón, Spain, Transmedial in Berlin, and the ZKM Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe, Germany. Other countries that have hosted shows of her work include Russia, Brazil, England, Canada, and Mexico. And domestically across the US, she has shown work in San Jose, Washington, DC, Los Angeles, among many other cities, too numerous to list here. Her work is in the collection of the Whitney Museum of American Art and has been widely reviewed by such publications as Artforum, ArtNet, the Brooklyn Rail, and Hyperallergenic. She earned her MFA at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago in Film, Video, and New Media in 2004. She's Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Art, otherwise known as Complicated People, at SUNY Buffalo, where she teaches courses in design and emerging technologies. I am grateful to Professor Rothenberg for her visit to my class earlier this fall and for agreeing to be here with us today. We look forward to her extended stay in the spring. Please join me in welcoming to the stage Professor Stephanie Rothenberg, the 2018-19 Roux Scholar.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for that beautiful introduction. I want to say that I'm truly honored to be here. I've spent a bit of time so far. The semester just started, and I'm just so delighted. I find Bowdoin to be such an amazing school. The faculty that I've met so far are absolutely brilliant and so generous, and the students, which some of them are over here that I went tidal pooling with. Didn't get to go snorkeling or to Hawaii, but maybe next time. So it's just a pleasure. It's, you know, I'm from Buffalo, New York. Well, I'm not from there, but I've been there a long time. So it's also a delight to be here in Maine. It's my first time in Maine, and I know that's kind of strange, but I'm absolutely spellbound, and I've been fortunate to have nice weather when I've come, and you know, I'm glad that today it rained and we can be inside. You know, yesterday it was beautiful. And so I really want to thank Dean McCormick for this opportunity that I can be here and I could work with all the Bowdoin faculty and students. And also the Roux family, thank you so much, David and Barbara, for this opportunity and your generosity. And the building is absolutely gorgeous, and it's so great to see the kind of facade now all opened up and the beautiful glass building. I also want to thank my host team that's helped me get my bearings here. Mark Wetley, Eileen Johnson, and Keisha Payson. And also helping with coordination, Rosemary Armstrong and Jean Bamforth, who have really helped with on-the-ground logistics. And then also, a really warm thank you to the art department, Michael Colster, of course, who gave me my first tour of the campus and is just so knowledgeable about all the history of Brunswick and the school, as exemplified in your introduction. And also Jackie Brown and Erin Johnson, whose classes that I went to and visited along with Michael's class. So as my introduction says, my talk's going to be a little different. I am an artist, first and foremost. But I'm an artist that's very fascinated by systems and methodologies and infrastructures and the way that they do relate to social concerns. And so when I talk about my work, and someone hasn't seen it, or even if I'm talking about my work and they're looking at it, they oftentimes, kind of give me this curious look. And I'm like waiting, and I kind of know what's gonna happen, and I start talking about economics and microfinance, or mycelial fungi networks and biological market theory. And then of course it comes, they sort of interrupt me and they're like, so you're an artist? And so the premise of my talk is really talking about these challenges of being an artist. And that's why I like to tell that story, because I really want to underscore the importance of interdisciplinary practice and thus an interdisciplinary education. And that is something that I've witnessed here in my short time at Bowdoin. And that this is so important even beginning in kindergarten. And we kind of see that happening more in kindergarten. And K through 12 program initiatives such as STEAM, where we see the sciences, technology and engineering and math really integrated with art, are so incredibly critical to ensuring that students become fully literate 21st century citizens that can tackle today's global problems that you've just heard from our previous speakers, and that pretty scary IPCC report. So in thinking about the relation of art to the sciences, I feel that art creates a different access point for these types of critical inquiry and reflections. And the one thing though is I don't feel that the art should be undersold, and I think that sometimes this happens, right? Art, it's not decoration, and it's not something that should just be a facilitator to these other disciplines, but it's something that should be given equal weight. And especially when we see all the defunding happening with the National Endowment of the Arts and the National Endowment of the Humanities, that it's just really, really important. And that art making is actually a form of knowledge production. And it is a valued practice. And it can be used to solve problems, these like wicked problems that are confronting all of our life forms, as we've just heard about. So to begin, we're going to start with romanticism to post-reality in 15 minutes. And I want to start with this image, and some of you might be familiar with it. This is Thomas Cole and his painting from 1844, View of the Two Lakes and Mountain House, Catskill Mountains, Morning. And I bring up this painting. He's acknowledged as the founder of the Hudson River School of Painting. It's a movement in between the 1820s and 1880s, and it was very significant in painting. It was a radical turning point. Portrait painting had been dominant, and this is the first time that we see landscapes as actually site-specific, and that they're not, as previous, allegorical, where they were depicting biblical narratives or Greek gods or Europe. Here we see these cross currents of romanticism. I mean, they are idealized portraits of nature, with this kind of dramatic lighting. But we start to see, right, humans and nature coexisting peacefully. And these paintings also are very significant in the sense that they're dealing with these themes of the 19th century, right? Discovery, exploration, settlement, and they become a form of nationalism in representing the new American frontier. But the reason I'm also showing this is because they're very significant in thinking about that buzzword that everyone's been talking about, the Anthropocene, right? This period of geological time where man's activity, man's footprint, humans' footprint on Earth really becomes environmentally significant. And in this period of industrialization, and granted, I'm aware that the Anthropocene goes back way, to more like 1400s, but in looking at this art historical moment, you start to see these dualities between, nature as to these new Europeans, coming at this time period, this frontier, that it's both a forbidding wasteland, but it's also this storehouse of economically valuable resources. And that wilderness, right, is something to be civilized and brought under human control in the name of progress. So here we see, right, this man, you can kind of see him in the landscape looking out. And we're gonna go, we're gonna jump up quickly a little over 100 years to a woman in the landscape. And this is Agnes Dennis, who is considered the godmother of environmental art. She's also known environmental art, the land art movement that was in the 60s and 70s, where you see artists using materials of the earth, soil, rocks, that are on site as a gesture against the commercialization of art making, the rejection to overly commodified urban life. And what's interesting about Dennis, some of the other land art movement significant artists, Michael Heiser, Walter DeMaria, Robert Smithson, Spiral Jetty, probably familiar with, was that she was one of the first to really bring this movement back into the urban spaces. And this is one of her best known works. It's interesting, you see the Twin Towers, this landscape of New York City. And what's, so kind of fascinating is seeing that out of the rubble, right, of lower Manhattan, this rubble-strewn landfill, this wheat field, this garden of like wheat is prospering, it's growing. And, and it's also just a few, 100 miles down from the Catskills. And so you start to see once again this idea of the Anthropocene, right, this human nature divide, but also these notions of resilience. And within this, detritus, this pollution, right, this garden of wheat emerges. So we're going to jump a little bit later to another artist, Mary Mattingly, and I realize these are really tiny, and her project, which is called Swale. And this one traverses land and sea. And so once again, not too far from that other location where Agnes is, we see, the Manhattan skyline. And Swale is a 130-foot floating food garden that travels up and down the East River, and it makes stops along the way from the Bronx, from Brooklyn to the Bronx. And it's a garden, it's a commons, so anyone can access healthy food. And Mary Mattingly did this because in New York City, foraging for food is illegal. And so the floating garden circumvents these rules about foraging on public land because technically it is on the water. And so Mary says that, because not everyone has access to healthy food, especially in New York City, she sees Swale as a tool to advocate for policy change. Since marine common law is different from New York City's public land laws, Swale can pave a pathway to create public food and public space. And talking about these intersections between artists across the disciplines, this is a really large-scale endeavor. Let me jump to a better image of this where you can see it in different contexts. It includes a wide range of edibles and medicinal plants. So it required collaborations with horticulturists, food scientists, urban planners, and a broad range of community organizations. So I'm keeping with this garden theme, but we do get into water a little bit more. We saw some water. And so this next project is by a collective called Critical Art Ensemble. And almost everything they do, they collaborate with scientists. And this project in particular, called Free Range Grain, is a live performative action that uses basic molecular biology techniques to test for genetically modified food in the global food trade. And so they consider this an interventionist performance. So they want to demonstrate how the smooth space of global trade enables the very contaminations the authorities say it guards against. So in the project, Critical Art Ensemble, they constructed this portable public lab to test foods for common genetic modifications. And members of the public could bring food to them that they found suspect for whatever reason, and they would test it over a 72-hour period to see if their worst suspicions were justified. And of course, most of them were. And then I also want to talk about this project by a Turkish-American artist named Pinar Yildiz, and it's called An Ecosystem of Excess. And Yildiz kind of frames her practice as a speculative biology, in which she's designing tissues, organs, organisms, biological systems, ecotypes, and ecosystems in order to catalyze creative, critical thinking. And her process merges both hand drawing and sculpture, as you could kind of see from these organisms she creates, with bioengineering and digital technologies. And for her, an ecosystem of excess, it's an attempt to create a post-human ecosystem, right? A living community of speculative organisms and their environment. And the project takes the idea that we're surrounded by all these man-made extreme environments, these sites of excess, where leftovers of consumerist actions are accumulated. And she refers to Kantian aesthetics when she says, in this piece specifically, she's looking at the Pacific trash vortex, that giant plastic spiral, that she looks at that as a truly sublime kinetic sculpture that's built by nations around the Pacific Ocean over many years of mindless, unsustainable consumption. So it kind of ties into the sublime of the early Hudson River School painters. And so she sees this is where plastic bottle caps meet the albatross's digestive tract. And looking at primordial soup theory that talks about, right, 4 billion years ago, life starts in the oceans, that today the oceans have turned into a plastic soup. And what she's asking, and this is another great image, what she's asking is if life started today in the oceans of plastic, what kind of life forms would emerge out of this contemporary primordial ooze? So there's so many different artist projects, and I wish I could go on forever, but obviously I can't, and I'd be happy to talk about more of them. But I will jump into a recent project of mine, so keeping with the garden theme, telematic gardens. And it's what Michael had mentioned, that it looks at the complex relationship between economic growth and human life through a robotic garden. And what's significant in this robotic garden is that plants represent human life within the context of a large abstract data visualization. And after hearing your talks, I just want to show you more artist and data visualization work. So the project's called Reversal of Fortune, Garden of Virtual Kinship. And what it does is it maps the virtual transactions of charitable social media users onto a physical map that's designed as a garden. And the map consists of over 650 small specimen containers of soil and seed. And these seeds represent borrowers of microloans within the global microfinance industry. So the majority of the borrowers are located in the developing world in areas that are economically or politically challenged. The loans are to support small scale but critically vital projects such as, cows for a small farm, roofs for a village school. And the hope within the project is that the seeds receive water and become plants, and these projects are able to sustain themselves. So just as the seed plant represents the borrower, water is symbolic for surplus capital, disposable income that is circulating throughout the system. And what becomes visible, as you can see on the LED screen here, are the huge fees, the loans that borrowers are paying within the microfinance industry, sometimes up to 50%, for $150 that, for us in the Western world could be the price of weekend groceries. And the reason the plants are so important in this piece is that it's a way of injecting a sentience and a life into what are normally desensitized, abstracted data visualizations that in actuality are representing critical information about the living. And here you can see again, and I will just play really quickly. So this is just kind of ambient sound, but you could get a little sense of it in action. So it's a giant CNC machine plotter. And this is at a space called ZKM that's in Karlsruhe, Germany, and it's directed by a media theorist artist named Peter Weibel, who actually got his PhD from University of Buffalo. So when I was there, he was very excited and gave me a bunch of heavy books that I had to put in my suitcase. But it's a very big media arts center. And so what basically happens is the plants are really just getting a few drops of water, and most of it is going to the second tank, which is really showing the profit within the microfinance industry. So you can kind of see there's little drops. Okay, I'm going to jump to the next. I think that gives you a sense of it. So reflecting pools in the garden, just to conclude, I thought it was important to also talk about my pedagogical practice. And I just co-launched a social justice graphic design lab called Platform in the Department of Art, University of Buffalo. And this has evolved out of many years in Buffalo of working with my graphic design students and local nonprofits and giving a visual integrity to their issues, a visual platform, so to speak. A lot of the groups, it's very vast. We've worked on projects for sustainable public transportation, renewable energy in low-income neighborhoods, the need for a living wage. And from doing this kind of work, it brings up, what is really important for this next generation of students. What are the type of skills? What are the attributes that they really need? What do they need to get, in this educational context? And so, what I started thinking about is always most important is the issue of ethics. The projects that you do in school aren't necessarily what you do in the real world, and you're going to be posed with a multitude of ethical dilemmas. And speaking on behalf of working with a lot of designers, you run into these issues of clients, companies who have a particular mission or agenda that you don't believe in. So I think it's really important that ethics is something that is discussed and focused on, in higher education. Also, I know we've talked a lot about critical thinking. I think that's something that everybody is really aware of. And in terms of data, I think it's really important, data and technology with all of these issues of privacy and surveillance and, getting the next latest device and issues of truth in data, right? And how do we understand those biases and those hierarchies and where is this data coming from? And then I also wanted to put down patience. I think patience is really important, and I kind of connect patience to, being able to sit back, and be calm and figure out how to problem solve and troubleshoot, right? You're gonna have to experiment, and things aren't always gonna come at once. Collaboration and teamwork, you can't do everything on your own. You're gonna, have to partner with other people, and so it's so important, for cooperation, collaboration, for skill sharing. And then lastly, just the ability to navigate the real world. And through these experiential learning scenarios, students develop these interpersonal skills, client management skills, the ability to be able to stand on the stage and feel a sense of agency. Giving presentations about your work is so important. So I will conclude there. And I just want to say thank you again for inviting me to, participate in this wonderful opportunity. And I'm really looking forward to the academic year here.